Hi, and welcome to Making Waves on Purpose. My name is Jeff Senny, and today I'm joined by Jim Hanna of Microsoft, formerly at Starbucks and Yellowstone, Xanterra. He's been around in the sustainability space for many, many years, and he and I have known each other for much of that time. I consider him a friend, and we are also partnering together at Fractal CSOs, along with Jill and Chad and Lena, who I will also have on the podcast. Jim and I discussed a lot about the business case for sustainability. Jim has always made the strong point that the business case has to be the beginning of the conversation. And he said something really profound, I thought, is how he approaches it with business leaders is he asks, what keeps them up at night and how are they bonused? I think that's a really smart way of thinking about and sussing out what drives leadership behavior. And he also talks a lot about mind share. So without any further ado, I'll bring you Jim Hanna in a great conversation. Thanks for joining us. Hey, Jim, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Jeff, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Living the dream.
All right, good. Well, speaking of living the dream, you and I have been in this space for a long time and have known each other for a long time. Tell me, how are you feeling about the modern moment, the good, the bad, and the ugly?
Well, I think if we keep it to the scope of sustainability, I've always been on the positive side of the equation. For me, as you and I have talked about many times over the years, I have a primary focus in my pathway in my career around making the business case for sustainability. And whether that's with Microsoft in my current job or my previous years leading sustainability at Starbucks or Yellowstone, or you pick the place, that's always been the equation that I try to bring into the conversation with folks. And for me, really the evolution of the sustainability industry, which, I do call it an industry because it certainly is, and our shift from anecdotal, qualitative storytelling to prove our business case for why we ought to exist and why we ought to get resources within our companies and organizations. Been on the front end of that conversation of shifting that to a more quantitative, business-driven conversation. And it's really interesting for me because we all read the LinkedIn posts, we all have large networks in the space and the industry, and it feels like there's a lot of debate around that business case conversation and a lot of debate around whether or not our industry should be able to simply fall back on right thing to do conversations because of the huge climate issues we face or human quality of life issues we face or all these other issues we face. And I think often that flies in the face of the fact that we work for corporations that are profit driven, and we need to be able to fit within that mantra in order to succeed and get the resources that are necessary for us to succeed. So, personally, I think I've had a lot of success at doing that over my career. I've been able to share a lot of those wisdoms with other folks as well. And for me, I have a lot of confidence in our industry to be able to tackle the major issues that we face as a planet. Certainly, timescale is going to be the critical limiting factor in whether or not we can do it in time.
It's interesting. I had a conversation with Andrew Winston a few months back, and he said something. I reached out to him. I've known Andrew for a long time, and he was talking about business case. And I said, okay, but what about when the business case isn't evident and you can't prove it? And he said, something that I thought was pretty profound. Businesses shouldn't be exempt from discussions of right or wrong. But I think you're right. Like, we should use the business case. And I think the boom of ESG kind of atrophied the business case muscle in many, if it ever existed, in many corporate responsibility teams, because they kind of said, it's fait accompli, like now everybody's asking us for it. But I would argue that ESG, especially because it was investor driven, was 100% or is 100% about the ROI, because investors aren't doing this to save the world.
And I would say yes and no. I think the ESG movement and the momentum it's had over the last several years was a reflection of incidents that happen in society. And I think that the tailwinds that created for us, and shame on us for not taking advantage of those tailwinds. And I think you're starting to see a plateauing of ESG conversations, of ESG investments, and companies who didn't take advantage of that tailwind to make the smart investments, to do the hard research, frankly, that it takes sometimes to make the business case. They're able to fall back and roll back some of those programs because they're able to fall back on the fact that it doesn't make a business case sense, which I completely disagree with. So, the fact that it was investor driven is really critical indication of certainly there are business drivers out there for our investment in ESG programs and to tracking our performance against those, which I think is a really critical component of whole ESG versus sustainability debate of what the two are. And for me, the loss of momentum is often demoralizing because we didn't take advantage of it. And we continue to use a lot of the same denominators versus using that as a springboard to really start to quantify some of these business impacts. And we can speak academically about this all day long. I always like to speak about real world examples of driving the business case. I'll harken back to my early days at Microsoft when I first joined the company, and what I wanted to do when I joined on the data center team, actually building the data center sustainability function from the ground up for Microsoft, was get all of our data centers LEED certified. And for a lot of companies, that's table stakes, but the data center industry hadn't really gone down that pathway. The business metrics that were critical for Microsoft at the time were speed and scale, because we were building the hyperscale cloud for cloud customers, and demand continues to exceed supply, in our industry. And so that was the business driver that we all heard every day, was speed and scale. And if you did anything to negatively impact speed and scale, you wouldn't get any resources for it. And if you did things to positively impact for it, then you made the business case for your investments and you're able to get that. We've always seen LEED as kind of a bolt-on green investment that companies make in order to get a plaque on the wall and reduce their environmental footprint of their buildings. But for us, I really took LEED as a way to standardize a building process across our global portfolio that could be responsive to a multitude of international green building standards that we were being required to snap to by local permitting authorities and the like. And we could just say, hey, we're doing LEED Gold. We created the LEED volume standard for data centers with the U.S. Green Building Councils, which it didn't exist before we jumped in. And it became something that actually helped us accelerate growth and scale, time and scale versus decelerating it. And with those data points in hand, it created a situation where a business leader who may or may not care about climate change, it was a no-brainer decision for them to execute on these programs. And these are the kind of things we really have to focus on. Is efficiency is the ultimate business case, but not everything is going to cost less. You have to look at those metrics that maybe two or three spaces down the road to make those connections between your proposed investment in sustainability, time and mind share and resources, and the business impact that those might have. And I think a lot of us, when we're attempting to do that, will fall back on employees are demanding this, and younger generations of employees are demanding this, and they want to work for companies that align with their values. And that is certainly a good foundation, I think, that we can use across the board to begin making the justification for investment in sustainability initiatives. But again, when you go to a senior leader in a company who has very specific annual metrics, who's bonused on a very finite set of measurements, and you say, well, in general, people who invest in sustainability and ESG programs have a higher performance on Wall Street, that doesn't really help them make a day-to-day decision. So you have to get much more granular about tying it back to their business needs. And the first thing I do when I meet a new leader is I say, what keeps you up at night? And how are you bonused? And then I go back and do the hard analysis to try to link my proposed sustainability investments into their metrics versus telling them that they have a new carbon metric that they have to track against. And I've gotten so much more traction by taking that approach with leaders. And I think that's where we as sustainability professionals need to be really smart about business and really understand what drives P&L and really understand what the finite set of metrics that drive profitability in our company and work to align our investments around those.
I think you're spot on. I think it's really interesting that speed and scale are the metrics. Many would think like, oh, it's a business case. It's all about money. Well, there is a readily accepted set of drivers of profit and growth within your context that are speed and scale. Others, it might be attraction and retention of the best and brightest. Others, it might be sales and differentiation or brand or innovation. You talk a lot about innovation and how sustainability can drive innovation. So I think that's right. I think there are interesting perspectives within the CSO role. And some people have really strong business acumen and maybe not enough sustainability. And maybe there's vice versa is true as well. I love this idea of what keeps you up at night and how are you bonused. Tell me a little bit about how those conversations go. And I would imagine quite swimmingly.
Yeah, definitely. And I think in our years of conversations with fellow sustainability professionals, getting internal traction is the primary challenge for us in succeeding. And internal traction, what I mean by that, and again, I use this phraseology a lot, is we're in competition with other people in our business for limited time, resources, and mind share. And time is obvious, resources is obvious, it's headcount, it's funding. And mindshare is something that we don't often talk about, but the ability of a leader in a company to absorb multiple things and prioritize multiple things is highly limited. And for us to be able to be one of the things that he or she focuses on and prioritizes, that's a big challenge for sure. And so getting into their head of understanding what drives them is a really critical space for me, so that when I walk in the door to a senior leader and talk to them about sustainability programs, it's not, oh, here comes the green guy pushing his metrics and his work onto me that are going to divert me from the primary drivers that I'm measured by. Now I've got a relationship where they see me as an asset to them achieving their targets versus a distraction from achieving their targets. It's a really critical shift that I think we have to make as an industry. Is certainly externally, we need to report against our environmental performance, and we need to make sure that our job is to make sure we mitigate our footprint as a, whatever business we happen to be in. But internally, our job is to make sure we get the investments that are necessary and the resources necessary to make that happen. And it's two sets of languages, when you look internally versus externally. And I think that's something we need to critically understand. And I love the diversity of where CSOs are coming from now. When I graduated long, long ago in the 90s with an environmental science degree, I went straight into the environmental industry, and I've never left that industry. I think that creates limitations, or has created limitations on myself, because I've never had a true business role, and I've had to learn that aspect of the work over time in order to succeed. But people are coming from the business who already have owned a P&L, who have already run an operational organization or a supply chain organization, or whatever it happens to be, and also understand the importance and the measurement tools that we utilize in the sustainability industry. I love that diversity of those people entering CSO roles. So I think that's been a fantastic evolution of our industry over the last several years.
We've got to meet in the middle, right? The sustainability, environmental folks who came from that side have to understand the P&L, have to build their business acumen, and vice versa is true, because otherwise it becomes greenwashing. That's on the other side. The sustainability professional that doesn't drive business value risks at being irrelevant, and the business leader who doesn't understand sustainability risks greenwashing.
Absolutely. And I think I saw that during my days at Starbucks, where as a B2C or a business to consumer company, you have a whole different set of drivers for what you can prioritize and, what you have to focus on as a sustainability professional. And one of my biggest pet peeves I love that company, with a passion, and I miss working at Starbucks. It was a fantastic place to work. But one of the biggest challenges with B2C companies is often being at the whim of customer movement. And, I've talked about this many times, but when all of our customers really cared about at Starbucks were straws and cups, and created headlines around that, and created shareholder resolutions around that, and just created massive external pressures on the company to address that. The fact that straws and cups were a rounding error within our total footprint became irrelevant. And we had to dedicate that limited time, mindshare, and resources to tackling straws and cups, at the detriment, unfortunately, of tackling things that really were the most important factor for Starbucks carbon emissions or environmental footprint or the like, with those limited resources. So I think being able to have that balance, as you said, of both placating the folks who are the tastemakers for your company, understanding the business drivers, not greenwashing, those are balls we all have to be able to juggle as professionals in that space. And it's both exciting and challenging at the same time. It's what I love about our jobs.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think the Starbucks example is a great one, because it is understandable that people who have this kind of 5-minute intimate relationship with this cup don't want that to go. I had the same thing. Like, I just got back from traveling yesterday, and they hand you a cup and you think to yourself, like, okay, I'm going to use this cup for the next 5 minutes, and then it's got to go in a landfill someplace for how long?
Yeah.
Just so that I could have a glass of water or a Coke or whatever, or a coffee. Like, it seems crazy. But that's not really about Starbucks. It's essentially we're kind of slaves to the system that has been built around us, and we're trying to kind of re-engineer that system, which is heavy lifting.
Yeah, and to use an old school term from the 90s, I wish that Starbucks, that discussion around cups and straws would have been a gateway drug to talk about what really mattered for that company's environmental footprint. Because certainly you have to solve the things that are most tangible, touchable for your customer base. As you said, there's a certain amount of emotional baggage and guilt that comes with the fact that you have something in your hand that you now know is going to go in a landfill for your 5 minutes of drinking your water or your coffee. And so companies certainly have to be responsible for tackling that. But what we ought not be doing as companies is then checking the box and saying, all right, we've solved this. We need to use those as transition conversations to, hey, if you're concerned about Microsoft's environmental footprint or Starbucks' environmental footprint or Xanterra's environmental footprint out in Yellowstone National Park, sure, I want you to be concerned about solid waste, but you should also be concerned about X, Y, and Z. And whether that's the carbon emissions of dairy, which is by far the largest emissions for Starbucks, whether that's the nitrous oxide that goes into the whipped cream chargers for Starbucks, which is also a massive carbon footprint, or the buildings and the stores that they build all over the world and how they build those, in a green way. Those are the kind of things that are really critical. And I think responsible companies need to communicate with their stakeholders in a transparent way versus just saying, all right, we solved the straw recycling issue by getting rid of straws and going to sippy cups. So check the box and leave us alone, which is certainly when you get back, hearkening your days of your conversations with Andrew around corporations having values and responsibility for society. Those are the kind of things that we can pull the trigger on that others can't do, is bringing that level of transparency to what really drives a corporate footprint and challenging our stakeholders to hold us accountable in that space.
And it's funny, I think that exists in the B2B space to a certain extent as well, because I've been surprised at how many CSOs took up what I think is a fairly lazy is maybe not the right word, but uninspired approach to SBTI. So many of them pushed, we've got to all join SBTI. It's the thing, everybody's going, rather than having deep, meaningful conversations of what this means for the business. And we're now seeing the backlash against SBTI as a result, because people didn't have all of those conversations. And basically the conversation is, this is going to be hard.
Oh, yeah.
This is not an easy thing to solve, for Amazon or Starbucks or any company.
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, we often want to have first mover status for anything. And I think we also have the FOMO syndrome of, if we don't sign on to the latest declaration, whatever it happens to be, then folks will say that we're not participating in the solution. So that certainly plays, I think, in the challenge. But I think your point around this is really hard. And the cool part about my job today is I'm able to focus down very specifically from a broad set of sustainability implementation metrics into my primary, almost sole focus these days is embodied carbon in our data center construction, materials, and supply chain. So it's steel, concrete, air handling units, generators, chillers, really all the things that make up the bulk of the infrastructure of a data center, and finding ways to accelerate the decarbonization of those supply chains in a meaningful way. Some of them are commoditized supply chains that have been around for hundreds of years, but to accelerate their decarbonization in a way that we can all start to actually meet these really hard targets that we have around reducing our Scope 3 emissions. And I've talked a lot about the politics of Scope 3 for sure, but in the current state of politics where we don't have the third leg of that stool of strong government regulation, it's really fallen to corporations to be the quote regulators of carbon emissions in supply chains. And certainly I think the reflection of as large companies taking on that role has been fantastic, like I said, in the absence of policy. And our ability, I think, to do the hard work in that space is something we're all focused on pretty intently right now, because a lot of companies have some pretty significant FY30 targets that are right around the corner.
I think you're spot on. And I also agree with the problem of the absence of policy in the space. I mean, we see the Europeans doing a bunch, and America makes halting steps at this occasionally. But our political conversation is so flawed right now. And companies, and I talk to business leaders who are like, hey, listen, that's not my job. And I'm like, yeah, I get that. And I kind of don't disagree with you. Like we would be better off if we had policy solutions, but you're going to lose a lot. Your business is at risk because of this, whether policy comes to your rescue or not. And I think that's where the SEC stuff really is focused, and rightly so, is to say, what's your risk? Because it's probably not insignificant.
Yeah. And I think in the absence of policy sledgehammers to force us to do things, which we can't necessarily expect in this country, we have substitutes for that, like the SEC disclosure requirements. I think like the Inflation Reduction Act, which creates incentives and direct investments into clean tech, and accelerators of decarbonization, which again, they're often seen as Band-Aids that are a substitute for just strong policy. But if we just sit back and continue to wait for that policy to emerge, we're another year down the road, another year down the road, another year down the road without progress. So I'm happy to take on that challenge, and that's one of the fantastic things about working for companies in the tech industries. We have the resources to take on those challenges, and we have the bandwidth and I think the influence to help drive solutions to those challenges. And it's a great place to be right now.
Well, let's just leave it there. I'm glad you're there. And
I am too.
I'm glad you're making it happen because it's important work. Thanks so much for joining us, Jim.
All right. Take care, Jeff.
All right. Be well.
You too.